Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on unaffordable housing, market failure or market success, featuring Ricardo Tranjan as our distinguished speaker. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the group of 78, which is sponsoring this event. First off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm making these remarks from the traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, which continues to be home to Indigenous people who have stewarded this land for millennia. The subject of today's webinar, unaffordable housing, could not be more topical or pressing. Hardly a week goes by without several stories in the media lamenting the unavailability of affordable housing, particularly for lower income Canadians, young families, and students in most metropolitan areas across the country. This week, for instance, the federal government announced it would increase funding for student housing on and off campus. And just in today's Globe and Mail report on business, a headline announced falling home prices, lower fixed rate mortgages spur affordability gains in some markets. You can almost hear the authors trying to eke out some good news from the housing scenario. Worse still, though, is the plight of the unhoused, the homeless, who may number as many as 300,000 today and up to 570,000 in 5 years. So the housing crisis is unquestionably one of the biggest challenges facing Canada today, and along with the rising cost of living, is likely to feature as one of the topmost issues in coming elections. We're fortunate today to be hosting two experts with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, with whom we're delighted to be collaborating. Experts who understand the complexities of housing markets. A warm welcome to you both. Our principal speaker, Ricardo Tranjan, has recently published his book, The Tenant Class, which has been taking Canada by storm. To set up our discussion, let me call upon our moderator to make some introductory remarks and introduce Ricardo. So our moderator, David Macdonald, joined the CCPA as its senior Ottawa economist in 2011, although he has been a longtime contributor as a research associate. Since 2008, he has coordinated the alternative federal budget, which proposes a federal budget with progressive aims and objectives. It proposes a budget that we really ought to have instead of the one that we're getting. David has also written and spoken on a variety of topics, from childcare to income inequality to federal fiscal policy. He is a regular commentator on national policy issues, often speaking to the CBC, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and Canadian Press. David, thank you for moderating. Over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Roy, and thanks so much to the group of 78 for the invitation to speak to you today. So I'm here to introduce Ricardo, my colleague, Ricardo Tranjan, political economist and senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, as I am. Before joining the CCPA, though, Ricardo managed the City of Toronto's Poverty Reduction Strategy Office and has briefly taught at universities in both Ontario and Quebec. He is the author of two books, A Scholarly Analysis of Participatory Democracy in Brazil, and what you've come here to see, the national bestseller, The Tenant Class. He holds a PhD from the University of Waterloo, where he was a Vanier Scholar. It was my great pleasure to work with Ricardo on our recent blockbuster report, Can't Afford the Rent, from July of 2023. It calculated the hourly rental wage that you would need to make in order to afford the rent in Canada's big cities. You compare that hourly rental wage to the hourly minimum wage and determine, for instance, that in Toronto or Vancouver, you'd need to make $33 an hour to afford the average one bedroom, even though the minimum wage in those cities was just over $16 an hour. Massive increases in rent due to high interest rates wouldn't be included in these figures, although it likely will be in our update to this report. In last year's data, there were only 3 cities where one could afford a one-bedroom apartment on average, making minimum wage. They were all in Quebec, Sherbrooke, Trois-Rivières, and Saguenay. And in only 10 cities out of the 37 that we looked at, was there even a single neighborhood where one could afford a one-bedroom apartment, making a minimum wage. But today, we're here to discuss Ricardo's best-selling book, The Tenant Class. It asks the thought-provoking question, what if there isn't a housing crisis, but instead the housing market is working exactly as intended, funneling wealth from working-class families to an elite property-owning class? With that, let me turn it over to Ricardo to walk you through these arguments. Although, as you're listening to Ricardo's speech, you can put questions in the Q&A box that Ricardo can respond to after he has finished his 20-minute presentation. You will find that at the bottom of your Zoom window. It is the box that says Q&A. You can just click in there and add your questions, and I will draw from those questions later on and pose them to Ricardo. So with that, over to you, Ricardo.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for those two very kind introductions. I'll get straight to it so that I can tell you what I have to tell you, and then we can move on to some discussions and make sure we have some good time for that part of the program, which is a very important part. So I do want to talk about the book, The Tenant Class, but what I thought I'd do today is to present to you a little bit the context in which the book comes about and what the book tries to do more broadly. So not speak only about the arguments and the ideas within the book, but a little bit about the book as a political project, and B, as kind of like a more theoretical intervention. So, and to do that, what I will provide you first is with a very quick kind of a pursuit of my pursuit of the research on housing in Canada, a little bit also of my pursuit of the advocacy work, and talk about the need to expand a little bit the debate about housing. So in short, what I'm going to argue here is that whereas we have a very vast and quite sophisticated understanding of the economics of housing and land and of markets more broadly, our everyday debates about housing are like this narrow, and that we need to kind of like to stretch that and to have more difficult conversations around housing. So what I see as someone who kind of has, like a little toe is still in academia, and I did work in government, and now I do the more applied research work that the CCPA is so well known for, is that in academia, you have a lot of really good quality research coming out on housing. We always have had that, and we continue to internationally and nationally. And you have a lot of good work there on dealing with questions of why we, manage housing the way we do, and in whose interests, and kind of connecting the everyday stuff that we see with housing with the economic structure of international capitalism, with financialization. There's really good work coming specifically out of geography or critical geography, like David Harvey and others that kind of study under him about the role of housing, for example, as a store of value and what that means, and so on and so forth. And so there are a lot of really good kind of like insightful stuff there. And then we have some academic work that's much more sort of empirically focused, but that do a sort of directly theoretical contribution as well. So I'm thinking about, for example, folks like Sarah Cooper at the University of Manitoba, who does really good, really detailed work on social housing, very empirically rich, but she usually frames it within sort of a clear normative and theoretical framework, so that it advances also work on sort of our views of the commodification of housing and so on. Then we have a lot of the public policy debate, which is not explicit about our theoretical foundations, and I say we because I'm part of it, and we're not very explicit about our normative stances either. And more often than not, that debate it stays within the realm of neoclassical economics. So we are in one way or another talking about supply and demand, and then in any given day, folks will be more interested in one variable of either side of this two, and discussing its impact, right? So of course the issue of the day now is international students, so that piece of the demand, and we're going to talk about it. And then there are folks who do a deep dive into the different kinds of supply, and then we talk about, we got to read into the weeds of that. But by and large, we sort of accept that entire framework of a housing market that is controlled by some invisible hand of sort, where supply and demand are not matching, and that's the essential problem that we're dealing with, and that we need some intervention to kind of arrive at some optimum equilibrium that after which everyone will live happily ever after. And of course, there is then the media coverage of this debate, which is even more simplistic often, and it's sometimes it's even kind of at the risk of scapegoat to one or other actors in all of this. So it's kind of, that's how I see the research a little bit on that. And I find it unfortunate, right? Unfortunate that we're kind of not drawing more in the sort of our everyday public policy debates on the rich body of literature that academics are and have since centuries produced on housing and land economics. And then in the advocacy world, what I see is kind of like three key fronts, right? So there's a lot of advocacy coming from non-for-profit that are service providers themselves in some way, shape, or form. And they are just kind of on the day-to-day of dealing with the kind of the hardship and the hardship that folks of low and moderate income are experiencing, or unhoused folks. And usually folks in that position, advocating from that position, they are in a situation where they're kind of accepting anything and everything from government. It's really in a kind of like the beggars can be choosers kind of mentality, because the level of need is so high, they're so underwater, that anything that governments kind of sends their way, it's better than nothing kind of thing. Then you have a second stream of advocacy that comes from the sort of use of the human rights language, housing as a human right. And that has a much more strong normative stance on the role of state, and the state should be stepping in much more aggressively in order to ensure folks have that right to decent house fulfilled. And sometimes that gets into an economic argument, sometimes doesn't, but that's kind of the gist of it. And then, which I found very interesting, we have a third sector of advocacy, which is the social movements, grassroots, tenant unions, Comité de Logement au Québec, tenant associations under various names, but these are associations and groups of tenants fighting landlords. Often they're not even engaged in politics or in broader debates, because their day-to-day struggle is against an eviction, it's against an above guideline rent increase, is in order to try to get some repairs done in their building. So very concrete, very immediate needs that they're dealing with. But interesting, a lot of these tenant organizers, they have a quite clear-eyed understanding of the market in an analysis that is much more similar to a class analysis of understanding the role of landlords versus tenants, much similar to the role of bosses and workers, and understanding the role of the state in supporting landlords through landlord and tenant boards, through legislation that is crafted most often than not in the interest of landlords, and so on and so forth. So although they are kind of, most of organizers are really into the weeds of the fighting of every day, I found in spending a lot of time with them either supporting the fight or doing research, is that I have a really clear-eyed understanding of the situation. So the book was my attempt to bridge a little bit the kind of everyday policy debates that we have that I argue are quite narrow, and this kind of broader body of knowledge that we have on housing and land economics, and to shine some light on the work of tenant movements. And so let me give you some concrete examples of what I'm saying in terms of knowledge that we could be tapping into in order to expand our debate, right? So from classic political economics, classical economics or political economy, which kind of the same back then, we had a really good understanding of land as a key source of contention. We had a really clear understanding of land as a unique variable that doesn't quite fit the supply and demand analysis, because for a number of reasons, because land, you can produce more of it, you can move it around, it values its value increases over time instead of deteriorates. So it's not a simple commodity. It's also not simply a factor of production. It's its own thing. And thinkers from liberals and socialists and the anarchists, and I'm talking about, kind of 18th, end of 18th, 19th century kind of stuff. They all agreed that land needed special attention, because if we ever let one group of actors to control and hoard land, that would not be good for society. That would not contribute to prosperity, because it would lead to what David Ricardo calls economic rent, right? So liberals discussed back then about like high taxations needed of land. Of course, socialists wanted to do something else, and then anarchists want to do away with the private ownership altogether, and so on and forth. There were debates about it, but there was this understanding like land on which housing is built is a special thing. So we lost sight a lot about that. We lost a lot of sight of that with the emergence of new classical economics that kind of pushed a lot of the messy power in politics out of economic analysis. And that's to the detriment of a more kind of nuanced conversations around housing, because we talk a lot about housing and not enough about the land on which housing is built, and we kind of assume it's the same, but it's not. So I'm going to give you two kind of concrete examples. We talk a lot about building housing, and you need to, what do we do to build more housing? And we talk a lot less about the development process. Housing development is not simply building housing. Building is one piece of the puzzle. Eventually, developers hire a building company that comes and build the thing, right? That's just one piece of the development process. And a huge part of the development process has to do with acquiring the land in a timely fashion, in a strategic manner, getting the rezoning and the paperwork for that land, allowing having enough power to lobby governments, to be able to deliver, to build whatever you want in that land. It has a lot to do with withholding on construction, because you cannot yet reap the sort of profit on the land that you expected to. So you hold back, let the land sit idle for a bit. It seems a waste for some people. For some people, it's just a line on the next spreadsheet, that one day will pay off. So this is the kind of like land and land speculation, and the extraction of rent from land speculation is a key aspect of building more housing that we don't talk about. We think as if there's enough land, we just go build stuff and off they go, and it's not quite simply that way. I'll give you another practical example. The whole conversation that we are having about inclusionary zoning right now. So this is the notion that some, especially the downtown core areas in places like Toronto and Vancouver, they have been zoned for single detached homes. That's a waste of space, and we need to densify those areas. We need to build more, and that way we will be able to create more housing. that will be affordable, and that's conversation, how would you actually make that affordable? But anyways, you build more housing, you make better use of public infrastructure, you make better use of social services by densifying areas that are already well served. That all makes sense to me. I'm a proponent. I think we do need to do away with exclusionary zoning and with neighborhoods that have been zoned for single detached homes. But what I find fascinating is that we're not having a debate about the amount of wealth that that process will create. The amount, the moment you change zoning that way, and that where you had one house, now you can have 9 units or more, you have created potential for a lot of rent extraction in that piece of land. When it's realized is a conversation, whether you build all at once and the prices go down, blah, 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 blah. There's details there. But by and large, we can agree that you're creating huge amounts of wealth. And we're not talking about the state recapturing any of that. We're not talking about why we're going to let the windfall gains of just owning that single detached home that now has been rezoned, so that you can build entire towers there. Why would you let the homeowner or the developer just walk away with that gain? Why is not the state intervening to recapture some of the wealth and invest in infrastructure and so on and so forth? The debate's not there. The debate's like, should it be 9 or should it be 4 floors? That's most of the debate about inclusionary zoning these days. So for me, it kind of lacks that understanding of land as the where house is built. And then there's a second thing that worries me is also about taking the supply and demand analysis to it critically. And I see a lot of the debates, we seem to forget that both supply and demand are never the work of free, of an invisible hand. There are policies that very deliberately shape both sides of the equation at any given day. They shape, they enable, and some of them are quite indirectly through infrastructure, to regulatory frameworks, and so on and so forth. But the market is not this natural or this uncontrollable process. They are markets are created and designed and shaped in many ways. I think I can remind you all of the conversation about interest rates policies today, right? Whoever thinks that the Bank of Canada is doing just what the modeling tells them without any political pressure or influence from powerful actors would be sort of naive in my perspectives. And then there's a whole body of literature there on development economics that it's very helpful. And then I kind of I came from international development studies, so that's part of my training. And so I will give you just one practical example how we could be using tapping into some of that. One of the things in development economics that I studied quite a bit was industrial policy, and there's this notion that governments are always doing industrial policy, right? It's one of the arguments in the literature, whether they call it that or not, or whether they're open about it or not. Governments are one way or another giving an advantage to some industries and either not creating advantages to other, or even putting disincentives in some industry. But that is always happening, whether or not it's within a framework of industrial policy or not. So that's a conversation that we're also not having, is the fact that over the past decades, the federal government in particular has opted for a number of policies that have supported immensely the real estate industry, that has supported banks and financiers. The most obvious example is the mortgage-backed securitization that the government put in place through the CMHC, where, long story short, mortgages are de-risked for banks and not for individual households. And that policy has created, that and other policies has created an immense incentive to invest in real estate. And we're not talking about, well, I mean, I'm starting to hear more and more conversations about low levels of productivity in Canada, low levels of investment in Canada, and yet I don't see enough links with the question of the real estate in a country in that it's so easy to reap so much and such high returns at very low risk from real estate. What would be your incentive to invest in anything else, right? There's in the Globe and Mail chart, 40 charts of the year or something, there's a really good chart there that's showing like, increases in real estate investment, and decreases in productivity and comparables. So I think, housing and the real estate industry should be discussed as part of that choice of the federal government in particular to protect and to incentivize a sector of the economy at the detriment of others, and not being very explicit about it. And we need to kind of talk about that. And the last point I'm going to make is there's also a really rich literature on coming mostly from post-development studies or critical political economy that takes a more historical approach on state interventions. And that challenges this notion of failed government interventions. So a lot of the public policy debate in Canada right now. So let me give you the theoretical example first. So the theoretical example, it's more international, and it talks about the World Bank and the IMF and the various development agencies that beginning in the 1970s through structure adjustment programs and other similar interventions came into developing countries in the South and provided all sorts of program and imposed more often than not because of that and the requirements, conditionalities for borrowing, imposed all sorts of economic programs on these countries and in order to help them to develop and to reach certain levels of economic growth and so on and so forth. And these policies more often than not failed. And there's a critical literature that comes and says, well, they failed on their explicit goals, but what have they accomplished? And then it talks about how these policies more often than not help to open markets for foreign industries, help to advance the interest of developed countries in a number of ways, help to push through the financial liberalization that we saw through the 1990s and the 2000s and so on and so forth. So while these policies fail on their own explicit goals, they accomplish many other things to the benefit more often than not of rich developed countries. So I think there's a conversation there too that we often see, and these I'm talking about now more like the housing advocates and the policy research kind of crowd. And I'm thinking about particularly since the 2015 when the federal government came back into the housing politics. And we see all of these interventions and all of these different strategies of the federal government. And more often than not, we see them from people who find that there are shortcomings on these policies. There is this notion that they don't go far enough, or that the government should do more. And originally was the first kind of reaction to the National Housing Strategy in 2017. Then it didn't go far enough. It needs to do more. It's too reliant on the private sector. And then 2018 comes, the budget, and we have the same reaction. And then we change the ministers, and we expect that there's something new is going to come out of it. And then we change another budget, and then we expect something that nothing new comes out of it. And we have consultations, and we have, revamped the strategies. And my question is, at what point we think, and when will the shoe drop for a whole, gamut of housing advocates that this particular government is not going to go against the interests of the market, that this particular government is not going to create more non-market housing, not only because it is timid, not only because it doesn't want to cough up the money, but that non-market housing comes at detriment of market housing that is extremely profitable, and that there's a sector of this kind of the economy that is very actively lobbying and advocating for preserving the market the way it is. So, and I give you a practical example. We get that with education and with health, for example. We understand that the reason why some folks on the right end of the political spectrum argue against public education, argue against public health care, and to try to privatize it is not only because they want a smaller state, is because they want to make a buck out of it. We kind of clearly understand that for some segments of society, someone who gets sick and go to the hospital and get a bypass surgery and go back home and doesn't pay enough money, and there's no profit margin there. It was a huge missed opportunity for profit making. And anyone who go from JK to 12 and in the public education system was also an immense waste opportunity to make money, because these very fundamental services, health and education, people will do whatever they have to do it to pay it, and so there's an immense opportunity for profit creation there. We don't think about, I think, in housing enough in that terms, that one of the impediments for non-market housing is not only that we're not coughing up the money, is that there's an entire sector that wants to keep the market the way it is for profit, because there's an immense amount of money to be made. There are high margins of profit that are made every day by landlords, because housing is so important. People will pay that first, right? Rent always eats first. So those are some of the things that I think we can borrow from different bodies of literature to kind of broaden a little bit the conversation about housing. And so now quickly to end on kind of what I did with the book. It is a very short and accessible book. I avoid a lot of this kind of more theoretical questions. I just kind of used them to kind of inform my work, but didn't necessarily add them to the text, not to make it kind of boring, essentially. And what I did in the book was to open it, challenging the notion that this is a housing crisis, because a crisis would assume that what we are seeing is it's kind of unpredictable, was unpredictable, that it negatively impacts everyone, and that everyone's interested in solving the problem, which is kind of not the case. Then it goes a little bit into, and then I present the tenant class as a class, and I argue why that it's a useful way of thinking about it. And I try to debunk some of the negative views about the tenants in Canada, who are by and large seen as second-rate citizens, right? People who didn't work hard enough, who didn't pull themselves by their own bootstraps, and therefore they're renting, right? Or young people who are going to grow up and then buy a house, right? Which is not true. There's a lot of data that I provide showing that neither of them are true. Renters work extremely hard. Renters are not all young at all, and so on and so forth. Then I present the landlord class, and then I debunk some of the romanticized views about landlords. And that's something that makes this conversation politically very difficult, because when you talk about bosses and workers, there's kind of a clear line that everyone gets. When you talk about landlords and tenants, there's kind of this Canadian culture, we have the romanticized, almost endearing notion of landlords, right? As someone struggling to pay their own mortgages, and someone whose financial security could and should be equated with the financial security of tenants. And so the book kind of go a little bit myth busting on that one, showing like who landlords actually are, and what's their net wealth, and what kinds of the size of these operations, the kind of returns that they have, and so on and so forth. And then I side a little bit with the tenant movement, a little bit, no, quite a bit, and quite explicitly, by telling a little bit about the history of tenant organizing in the country. Is a very rich and long-lasting tradition in Canada. So my first example goes back to before the Confederation. And then I have a more recent chapter on more recent organizing that shows a little bit what's going on with tenant organizing today. And I land with a note, that's the note that I'm going to end here too. This notion that we have to pick a side. That the notion that the so-called housing crisis is a technical puzzle that we all need to kind of get in there and just understanding, and in that understanding will set us free, and that we can have this win-win policy ingenious win-win policy solutions that will sort of solve the problem and allow everyone to live happily after. It's a misleading view, and it helps to perpetuate the status quo. I think when it comes to housing, there's two very clear sides. There are some sectors of the economy that are immensely benefiting from the way things are right now, and there are other and much smaller sector of the economy of the society that is not, that is actually experiencing the material deprivation and the housing financial security that is in part the consequence of all the de-risking that happened to this other group. And so that if you want to engage in a serious conversation about housing, we should pick sides. We should pick clear sides on what, for me, and within the tradition of political economy, has always been a incredibly and then fundamentally political and difficult political question about winners and losers. So yeah, I'll leave it there. It's kind of like my broad spiel and my short summary of the book, and then we can have all sorts of Q&A and conversations right now.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ricardo, for the presentation. We already have a question in the chat. If you do want to ask a question, just go to the bottom of your Zoom window and click the Q&A button, and there you'll be able to type a question in. It's not, we're not going to sort of raise hands. It's just a matter of typing a question in, and then I'll pose those questions to Ricardo. You can also go in and look at the other questions. You can vote them up and down as you wish. So why don't we start things off? I know, Roy, that you had an initial question that you wanted to start off and pose to Ricardo. So why don't I hand the floor over to you, and for other folks that have a question or want Ricardo to comment on, just click the Q&A button on the bottom of the Zoom window, and you will be able to ask that question. Roy, over to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Ricardo, for a very masterful survey of the political economy of housing. It's given us a great start to this discussion. I just wanted to build on your analysis and remind people that the Group of 78 is really all about international politics and international policy. To what extent when we think about housing, we're talking about an international market in which investors are global and footloose and able to move their capital to wherever the highest returns are available. Because Canada is hardly unique in having, as you put it, so-called housing crisis. The high prices, unaffordable housing are universal, with a few exceptions. And it would be interesting if you had any suggestions to mention countries that have perhaps addressed this in a socially progressive way, where the tenants and the losers and those who are disadvantaged in the markets are a leg up by the state. Anyway, just those two questions by way of openness.
Yes, one of my go-to sources for a more comparative international analysis is this book by Josh Ryan Collins. It's called Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing. So there's some really good work coming out of the Institute for New Economic Thinking in the UK And to your point, Roy, it really shows us how much of an international trend it is, and makes the point against the supply and demand conversation that you couldn't be seeing this very similar trend in so many countries if it was just a mismatch between supply and demand of number of households and number of houses. You wouldn't see that in so many different countries. And then it talks about the role of financialization and land speculation and all of this capital kind of moving around the world, and how much that is pushing prices up. And I think for me, one of the things that kind of stuck with me, though he uses different language than David Harvey, it's this notion of housing as a store of value, right? Sometimes it's hard for normal folks like us to think about people who have too much money and don't know what to do with it. And then they have to just kind of diversify their portfolio and stash money in different places. But that exists. And then sometimes I feel like, some of these condo towers in Toronto, they're literally like safety boxes for someone somewhere who needs to just kind of stash money and put it away. And so they talk about that as a huge drive of prices of housing internationally. What I've seen in terms of positive examples elsewhere in the country, elsewhere outside of the country, it's more in the area of, I don't think anyone, to my knowledge right now, is dealing with this problem adequately. What I've seen is better protections for tenants, right? Because then we get to questions of the cost of housing and the price of houses, and that keeps going up everywhere. But then there are the tenants that do not own and will rent and want to achieve some housing security long term without ownership. And I think in some countries that is a much easier thing to do than Canada. And it kind of requires it's something that you talk a little bit about the book, kind of differentiating between home ownership and housing security, right? Like the reason most people buy houses is not because they love spending their Sunday fixing the basement. It's because they want housing security. And in Canada, those are understood. Like the only way I would be security housed is if I owned. That's how I can make sure that my kids are going to go to the same neighborhood school and that I'm not going to be pushed out in the middle of a school year, right? So that's the housing security. So then the question is, can we achieve housing security or higher levels of housing security through renting? And what kind of the regulatory framework that we need in that? So there are countries, Germany, Sweden, Spain to a certain extent, where tenants are much more protected, and like in everyday kind of in France as well, they're more protected and on everyday matters like rent increases, but also where evictions are taken a lot more seriously, and any demand for eviction may trigger a legal process, like a real legal process, not an administrative process through a landlord and tenant board, right? So some countries have much better protections for tenants, and that ensures long-term housing security for a share of the population that doesn't own.
Great. Thanks, Roy. The next question we've got is from Jim Rutham. He says one of the sort of basic understandings of the free market is that it drives prices down to the level of costs, or hypothetically a perfectly competitive market will. For supporters of private rental, how do they think this will happen when new buildings are more expensive than the buildings that they replace in terms of the impact on average rents?
The short answer is trickle down, which in housing is called a filter down. So essentially they say you build new stuff, new and fancy, new and shiny stuff. Yeah, it's going to be expensive, but then who's going to move there? Is folks who are renting something that is a little bit cheaper. And then so they're going to make that available to other folks who are going to move up and move up and move up and move up. So they admit that the new housing is expensive, but they assume that the older housing will filter down or trickle down and become available to low and moderate income households. It's an empirical question. I won't say yes or no. It will really depend on the market and at the particular time you're looking at. Some cases it happens, some cases it doesn't. So I don't reject the argument altogether. I reject the assumption that that's what it happens every time, because it doesn't. You can see, for example, with gentrified houses, gentrified neighborhoods in the US and Canada, where like old places all of a sudden become very chic, and folks move in and remodel a little bit, and then these houses actually become even more expensive because their character in the neighborhood and the location and all other factors. There's a really good paper on this that kind of pretty balanced argument that looks kind of like a meta analysis of the literature, but I forgot the name right now of the author. But that's what they assume it will happen.
Okay. The next question actually from Susan James. And she wanted to have you go a little deeper on what is the landlord class? Is it the romanticized mom and pop landlords who are just barely scraping by trying to provide some student with a nice basement apartment? What does it look like, and how do landlords relate to developers?
So this was kind of the hardest thing to do in the book, was the chapter that tries to kind of categorize the different types of landlords. Long story short, the data in Canada on this is pretty bad. We have a lot of data on private purpose building apartment buildings, the big towers, but we don't have kind of a lot of data on the rest of it. So my estimates was that about 12% of tenants live in non-market housing of different sorts. It can be public housing, co-ops, not-for-profit housing providers. There's about 38% that rent from private landlords. So these are individual investors, and families who own one or more, own two or more homes. And then we have 22%, which I prefer to call small businesses rather than mom and pop landlords. About 20% were corporate landlords, so these are pretty large corporations. And about 8% that are financial landlords. So these are the real estate investment trusts. They're like financial instruments that own real estate assets and derive returns from them. And sorry, I'm that. And my point in the book is just, so there's the question of, the growing share of the stock that is owned by large landlords and by financialized landlords. But in the book, I also question the way we talk about these small landlords, these more mom and pop landlords. So first, and kind of gets in the cultural aspects of all of this, right? Because we think of landlords like it's their home, they're renting. You see a lot of their arguments: my house, I'm renting my house, and there's this kind of sense of entitlement to their property that is very common in North America. But once they entered a commercial relationship, that has to go. It's not your home anymore, right? It's your business, and as a business, it's regulated in a number of ways, and the consumer of that business has a bunch of rights as well as with other businesses. And so also as a business, there are risks, and sometimes you lose, sometimes often, hopefully, you earn more than you lose, so that makes a sustainable business, but sometimes you do lose. And I think all of that aspects of business and investment is kind of not talked about enough when we're talking about these small landlords. And there's a passage in the book where there's a story at the Toronto Star about this one family that decided to buy a second property during the pandemic, and then things went south, and they had to eventually, they had a hard time evicting the tenant, and they eventually had to sell the house. But the coverage of their story, it's kind of mesmerizing and disconcerting at the same time, because it's all about this poor family and struggling, and how like they bought the second property because they thought they were going to make some money, but now they're victims of this bad tenant, and this whole story is like makes you want to cry for this poor family. And what I do in the book, I simply paraphrase this story in a kind of in business terms. And I say, well, investor had some money put aside, decided to go into real estate because high returns and low risk. Turns out that they had some operational losses from the get-go. Eventually, they decided to sell the asset, and their capital gains more than offset the operational loss, and the capital gain was taxed at a 0.5% margin, at a 50% margin. That's a business. That's what they were in for. So that's the kind of challenges that I think we have to pose when we talk about landlords, and when we like awfully romanticize who landlords are in Canada.
Okay, great. Next question is from Akash Maharaj, and he is looking for practical policy prescriptions. He's saying, if you were the Prime Minister of Canada, which would you choose to make housing more accessible, that could be done quickly and sustainably? A lot of housing policy is actually provincial in nature, and so maybe you'd want to become the premier of one of the provinces. What policy prescriptions would you have there? In any event, what are some policy prescriptions, Ricardo?
If I choose three, rent controls. Rent controls are provincial, but the last time around we pushed rent controls through was in the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s, and it was actually initiated by the federal government because of high inflation. Because the federal government at the time understood that, rent is the largest expenditure for about 30% of the households in the country. If you prevent that from going up in a period of high inflation, it will have a positive impact on your inflation numbers. So the federal government at the time twisted arm a little bit of the provincial governments and encouraged them to impose rent controls. They all did at the time, and then over the kind of the following years, when the agreement expired, some provinces kind of did away with the rent controls altogether, and some of them have been like slowly dismantling them, like in Ontario. So rent control is one of them. The other one, it's pushing a much larger share of the total housing stock, the rental housing stock outside of the private market. There's a report from 1948 from the head of research at CMHC that clearly states that private rentals will not deliver housing for low and low income households. We have had 300 reports of the same conclusion since then. The finding still holds. But as I mentioned, that is not just, I think, about, it would be naive to think that is just about coughing up the money. Is about going directly against the interests of the real estate industry in Canada. So that would take a government that is not embedded with that industry and that it's willing to challenge that industry. The third one is to have a Bill of Rights for tenants at the federal level. I think the US is doing something on this front. So ultimately, it would be amazing to have tenants to have collective bargaining rights, much like workers do. And that could be a game changer in terms of organizing and negotiating for tenants.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ricardo. And Devin here asks, why we don't use the word feudal more often? is not the proper word to describe a landed rentier class that takes advantage of a rentier class. Wouldn't this framing be better or easier to understand, rather, to decide who's on which side?
That's an interesting preposition. I would think about the word feudal, but like rentier, I think it's definitely a term that we should use more. I think we do not talk enough about how this one industry is, walking away with bags full of cash, and the negative impact of that on the other sectors of the economy. We tend to focus a lot on low-income tenants that have to sacrifice other needs in order to make rent. But when they're sacrificing other needs, it means someone else is not selling something. When we talk about homeowners who have really large debt levels, they're also sacrificing a lot of consumption. So there's someone else who's not selling something to them. So there's and then there's also, of course, the kind of sucking potential investment in other, not only on the consumption side, but on the investment side. We have just read an article on the big boxes now also going into real estate, right? Because when there's so much money to be made on this one particular activity, why would you invest in something else? There brings a lot more risk, even if that something else would probably generate a lot more employment, positive, spillover effects into other industries, probably more tax revenues and all of that, contribute to prosperity more broadly. Why would you do that if there's more risk for you as an individual investor, right? Just go into real estate. So yeah, the rentier class is a good term. But feudal might be the right one too. Let me think about it.
Okay, well, thanks so much for the questions, everybody. We're just coming to the end of our hour here, and I would just hand it back to Ricardo for any final comments that you might have just to wrap today's session up in the hour that we allocated.
No, I just wanted to thank you. Thank you, the group of 78 for the invitation and for the platform. Thanks, David, for also helping to facilitate this. The Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, we're constantly producing stuff on housing and other topics, of course, but you can visit us and check out what we've been doing. This is the book that I wrote. The other book that I mentioned is Rethinking Economics, the Economics of Land and Housing, which I think this crowd might be particularly interested because of what Roy said, like the international and the comparative angle. I think that book does it very well. It's a little bit more academic-ish, but it's a really good, well-written and a really good information. So yeah, thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thanks so much, folks. And Roy, is there anything final things you wanted to say?
Not really. I'd just like to thank Ricardo particularly for his very incisive and boundary stretching analysis, which he has treated us for the past hour. Thank you to all the participants for participating, and those of you who raised questions. Thanks for those. Sorry if we didn't get around to your question. I'd like to thank Maud Stephanie, our executive secretary, who as usual has been intrepid behind the scenes organizer and promoter of our webinars. The next webinar, should anyone be interested, is going to be at the end of February, and it's going to be looking at Afghan women who are not much talked about anymore, but should be an interesting session featuring Corey Levine as our guest speaker. So I bid everyone goodbye, have a good afternoon, and see you in a month. Thank you.